For 5 years, Jerry had used Nala's clean African heritage and innocent name to launder his blood money, convincing her she was a nobody, a woman with no family, no identity, and no one who would ever come looking for her. But everything changed the night she slammed into the obsidian-black sedan of a man who looked at her like she was the only real thing in a city built on lies. The impact left Nala trembling against the hood, rain mixing with the fear in her lungs as Jerry's heavy footsteps pounded closer behind her. Then the back door hissed open. Ryung stepped out calm, cold, and terrifyingly still. Neon light glinted off his tailored suit, and the dragon tattoos curled up his neck as his sharp eyes took in the bruises, cuts, and pain written across her body. He didn't offer pity. He didn't reach for her. He simply stood between her and the man hunting her, an iron wall of danger and protection. For the first time in 5 years, Nala wasn't a ghost in someone else's ledger. She was a woman finally being seen by a man who ruled the shadows she was trying to escape. The impact was a sickening crunch of bone against cold, rain-slicked metal that vibrated through Nala's entire frame, nearly shattering what was left of her resolve. She didn't just hit the car. She collapsed against it, her fingers desperately clawing at the polished obsidian hood of the luxury sedan, as if it were the only solid land in a drowning world. Water cascaded from her curly hair, stinging the split in her lip and the deep purple bloom around her eye where Jerry's ring had caught her just an hour before. Every breath was a jagged shard of glass in her lungs, and her white dress, now a ruined rag of mud and lace, clung to her like a shroud. Behind her, the rhythmic, heavy thud of Jerry's boots was closing in, a predator sensing the kill. The back door of the sedan hissed open with a mechanical precision that silenced the roar of the storm. Nala looked up, her wide, tear-filled eyes meeting a pair of irises so dark and motionless they seemed to swallow the neon reflections of the street. Ryung stepped out into the downpour, but the rain seemed to hesitate before touching him. He was a pillar of unnatural stillness, dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than Jerry's entire laundry operation. His hair was slightly disheveled by the wind, but his expression was a mask of surgical ice. He didn't reach out to help her. He didn't offer a hand to the trembling woman bleeding onto his engine. Instead, he looked down at her with a clinical, cutting disdain that felt more dangerous than the man chasing her. "A clumsy distraction," he murmured, his voice a low, melodic vibration that carried the weight of a death sentence. He tilted his head, his gaze sweeping over her bruised face and the way she gripped the car for support. "Tell me, did my rivals send you to play the broken bird, or are you simply too incompetent to watch where you run?" To Ryung, she wasn't a soul in need. She was a variable, a potential trap set by the syndicates that circled his territory. He saw the map of lessons Jerry had carved into her skin and interpreted it as a costume, a carefully applied layer of gore designed to lower his guard. Nala tried to speak, but her voice was a ghost, caught in the back of a throat constricted by 5 years of silence. She looked from Ryung's cold, calculating eyes to the blurred shape of Jerry emerging from the shadows of the alleyway, his face twisted in a mask of possessive rage. She was caught between two monsters, the one who wanted to own her pulse and the one who looked at her as if she didn't even have one. Ryung's eyes locked forward, ignoring her frantic whimpers, his body language radiating a dominant, mysterious aura that suggested he was already deciding whether to save her or simply drive over her to keep his schedule. In this neon-lit purgatory, Nala realized that hitting this car wasn't just an accident. It was the moment her status as a ghost was being judged by a god who didn't believe in spirits. The heavy, wet silence between Nala and the man in the charcoal suit was shattered by the frantic splashing of footsteps. Jerry burst from the curtain of rain, his chest heaving, his face contorted into a mask of practiced, agonizing concern that made Nala's stomach turn. He skidded to a halt a few feet from the sedan, raising his hands in a gesture of peace that was as hollow as the marriage he had forced upon her. "Nala! God, Nala! Thank heaven!" He shouted, his voice cracking with a theatrical desperation that had fooled neighbors and police for half a decade. He stepped toward her, his eyes darting toward Ryung with a submissive, fearful twitch. "I am so sorry, sir. My wife, she's not well. She hasn't been taking her medication. She just ran out into the street. Please, let me take her home before she causes any more trouble for a man of your obvious standing." Ryung didn't move. He remained a statue of dark elegance, his eyes fixed on Jerry with a clinical lack of interest. To Ryung, Jerry was a small bully, a man who smelled of cheap sweat and overplayed drama. He looked back down at Nala, his hand moving toward the car door as if to close it and leave her to the wolf at her heels. He was a man who lived by a code of efficiency, and a domestic dispute was a messy, low-level complication he had no desire to audit. He began to turn away, his movements fluid and dismissive, ready to hand her back over to the man who used her name like a dirty rag. But then he saw it. As Jerry reached out a hand toward Nala's shoulder, her entire body didn't just flinch, it underwent a violent, silent metamorphosis. Her eyes didn't seek the comfort of a husband. They tracked Jerry's fingers with a lethal, terrifying hypervigilance. She didn't look like a woman who was unwell. She looked like a prisoner watching a branding iron. Ryung's gaze sharpened, catching the way Nala's pupils dilated and how her hand, still trembling on the hood of his car, moved in a subtle, defensive arc, a warrior's instinct buried under a victim's skin. He looked at her bruised face again, but this time he saw the map of lessons for what it truly was, a ledger of survival. "She is your wife?" Ryung asked, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that cut through Jerry's frantic babbling. Jerry nodded vigorously, moving to grab Nala's arm, but Ryung's hand shot out, his fingers locking around Jerry's wrist with a strength that turned the man's face pale. Ryung leaned in, his eyes narrowed as he caught the scent of cedar and the metallic tang of Nala's fear. "You say she is a ghost, a woman of no consequence. And yet, she carries the hypervigilance of someone who has seen the inside of a cage." Ryung shoved Jerry back with a casual, insulting flick of his arm. He didn't do it out of mercy. He did it because his curiosity had been piqued. If this woman was important enough for a man like Jerry to chase through a monsoon, she was a variable he needed to solve. "Get in," Ryung commanded, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. He didn't look at Nala as he spoke, his gaze already fixed on the dark horizon of the city. He wasn't saving her, he was seizing an asset. "I have questions about the paper trail you're leaving on my streets. And you," he added, looking at Jerry with a look of pure, predatory ice, "will stay exactly where you are if you value your pulse." As the door hissed shut, Nala was plunged into the leather-scented silence of the car, traded from one monster to another, realizing that her interrogation was only just beginning. The elevator ascended in a pressurized, clinical silence that made Nala's ears pop, rising toward the apex of a glass monolith that pierced the city's low-hanging clouds. When the doors hissed open, she was ushered into a space that felt less like a home and more like a high-altitude command center. The penthouse was a sprawling expanse of polished basalt and floor-to-ceiling glass, overlooking a neon sprawl that looked like a circuit board drowning in the rain. Ryung didn't look back at her as he crossed the room, his long, predatory strides carrying him toward a sunken pit filled with glowing monitors and three men whose fingers blurred across mechanical keyboards. Nala stood at the threshold, her ruined white dress dripping onto the pristine stone floor, her arms wrapped tightly around her chest as if she could physically hold her fracturing soul together. She felt like a stain on the perfection of the room. Ryung gestured toward a screen without breaking his stride. "Run her," he commanded, his voice a low, arctic vibration. "Nala Hudson. Scan every offshore link, every shell corporation, and every suspicious deposit flagged in the last 48 hours. I want to know who sent this clumsy distraction to my bumper." For 20 minutes, the only sound was the rhythmic clicking of keys and the distant hum of the building's ventilation. Ryung stood by the window, his back to her, a silhouette of iron and ink framed by the storm. Nala watched him, her hypervigilance tracking the slight tension in his shoulders, expecting him to turn around and demand to know which rival syndicate was paying her. She was prepared for an interrogation. She was prepared for a cage. She was not prepared for the silence that followed. "Sir," one of the hackers finally spoke, his voice tinged with a rare note of hesitation. "It's not a plant, it's a slaughterhouse." Ryung turned, his dark eyes narrowing as he approached the monitors. The screens were flooded with scrolling green text, Nala's name appearing thousands of times alongside transactions that moved like digital ghosts through bank accounts in territories she couldn't even point to on a map. "Explain," Ryung barked. "She's a primary signatory for over 50 laundering nodes," the technician explained, pointing to a series of encrypted transfers. "But the authorization codes are being generated from a secondary device, one registered to a Jerry Hudson. He's been using her social security number, her African lineage records, and her clean credit history as a firewall. He's moving millions of dollars of syndicate blood money through her name every week. If the authorities move in, she's the one who goes to prison for life. To the system, she's the mastermind. To him, she's just a human shield." The room seemed to grow colder as Ryung processed the data. He looked away from the screen and toward Nala, who was shivering so violently her teeth rattled. For the first time, the clinical disdain in his eyes flickered and died, replaced by a dark, simmering realization. He had judged her as a weapon, a clever spy designed to infiltrate his world. Instead, he saw a woman who had been hollowed out, her very identity stolen, and used as armor for a coward. He took a step toward her, and though she flinched, he didn't stop until he was standing just inches away. The scent of expensive cedar and cold metal was overwhelming. "I called you a clumsy distraction," he murmured, his voice losing its jagged edge but retaining its lethal weight. He reached out, not to strike, but to tilt her chin up with a gloved finger, forcing her to meet his gaze. "But you aren't a distraction at all. You are a woman being buried alive in paper and ink." The judgment was gone, replaced by a dangerous, protective heat. He wasn't saving a victim anymore. He was auditing a crime, and Nala was the only evidence he intended to keep. The storm outside the penthouse had settled into a rhythmic, mournful weeping against the glass, but inside, the silence was even heavier. Ryung had retreated into the shadows of the upper gallery, a ghost in his own fortress, leaving Nala in the vast, cold living area. He had ordered his staff to provide her with everything she needed, yet she sat on the edge of a basalt-colored sofa, looking as though she were afraid the very air of the room might charge her for breathing it. He watched her from above, his dark eyes tracking the way she held her shoulders, a defensive, coiled posture that had become her second skin. As the hours bled into the deep night, Nala began to move. She didn't go to the plush bed or the stocked kitchen. Instead, she knelt on the hard stone floor, facing the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out toward the dark horizon. From his vantage point, Ryung saw her reach into a hidden pocket of her ruined dress and pull out a small, worn string of wooden beads, dark and polished by years of touch. She closed her eyes, and a low, resonant hum began to vibrate from her chest. It wasn't a song he recognized. It was something ancient, a melodic tapestry of deep vowels and rhythmic clicks that seemed to pull the very warmth back into her shivering frame. This was the language Jerry had tried to beat out of her, the primitive noise he had mocked while he systematically erased her history to make room for his ledgers. But as Nala whispered the chant, her posture began to shift. The trapped bird in her chest seemed to steady its wings. She was calling upon a lineage of survivors, grandmothers and mothers who had endured sun and storm long before Jerry Hudson was a blight on the earth. Her voice grew slightly louder, a soulful, grounded sound that filled the sterile, high-tech vacuum of the penthouse with an earthy, undeniable life force. In the shadows, Ryung felt a strange, unfamiliar friction against his cold exterior. He had spent his life building a foundation of steel and clinical precision, but watching Nala reconnect with her roots, he realized he was witnessing a different kind of power. It wasn't the power of a gun or a bank account. It was the power of a soul refusing to be overwritten. His initial judgment, that she was a hollow shell, melted away, replaced by a profound, intrigued respect. He saw her now not just as a victim of a paper cage, but as a woman who carried an entire civilization's worth of resilience in her blood. He stayed in the darkness long after she finished, realized that while he had the city, she had something he had long ago discarded, an unbreakable sense of self. For the first time, Ryung didn't see a project. He saw an equal. The following evening, the penthouse transformed from a sanctuary into a silent war room. The clinical, high-tech air was thick with the scent of bitter espresso and the electric hum of multiple active terminals. Ryung sat at the head of a long, obsidian table, his dark suit buttoned tight, his expression a mask of granite as he faced a video conference with a shadowy conglomerate looking to finalize a massive infrastructure merger. Nala stood in the periphery, dressed now in a simple, structured dress of deep indigo that complemented her warm complexion, her hands folded over the wooden beads she had tucked into her pocket. She was supposed to be invisible, a guest in the shadows, but her hypervigilant eyes were locked onto the secondary data stream flickering on the wall monitor. As the lead negotiator for the conglomerate, a man with a voice like gravel began to detail the final escrow transfers, Nala's breath hitched. She didn't see numbers, she saw a pattern. It was a specific, jagged rhythm of microtransactions, a digital signature she had memorized over 5 years of being Jerry's unwilling ghost. While the men at the table discussed legalities and percentages, Nala moved. She didn't ask for permission. She stepped into the light of the monitors, her fingers hovering just inches from the glass. "Stop the transfer," she said, her voice low but carrying a sudden, crystalline authority that cut through the negotiator's drone. Ryung froze, his cold eyes snapping to her. The men at the terminals paused, their fingers hovering over the keys. "Nala," Ryung warned, his voice a low vibration of impending lightning. "This is not the time." "He's bleeding you," she countered, turning to meet Ryung's gaze with an absolute certainty that stopped the air in the room. She pointed to a series of subledger entries that looked like standard administrative fees. "Those aren't taxes. They are loop-back accounts. Jerry used the same routing structure to hide his laundry trails. If you send that money, it won't hit the escrow. It will trigger an automatic fraud alert with the international monitors, and the funds will be diverted to a seizure account held by a third party. You won't just lose the merger. You'll lose the capital and you're standing with the board." The room fell into a deafening silence. Ryung looked from Nala to the screen, his mind, as sharp as his blade, beginning to trace the path she had uncovered. He gave a sharp nod to his lead hacker. "Verify, now." Seconds felt like hours as the technician's fingers blurred. Finally, the man looked up, his face pale. "She's right, sir. It's a poisoned pill. If we had clicked execute, the entire syndicate's primary liquidity would have been flagged for federal seizure within 10 minutes. They were setting us up for a total financial decapitation." Ryung stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving Nala. He didn't look at the screen, and he didn't look at the disgraced negotiator on the call, whom he silenced with a single keystroke. He walked toward her, the space between them crackling with a new, dangerous energy. He had known she was a survivor, and he had learned she was resilient, but he had misjudged the sheer, lethal sharpness of her intellect. She hadn't just survived the digital cage, she had mastered its mechanics. He stopped just inches from her, the scent of cedar and ozone surrounding them. For the first time, he didn't look at her bruises or her history. He looked at her as a sovereign power. He reached out, his hand hovering near her waist before he let it drop, the restraint between them almost visible. "You saw what my best analysts missed," he murmured, his voice dropping to a register of intimate, profound respect. The first real spark ignited in the narrow space between them, a pull that wasn't born of pity or debt, but of two apex predators finally recognizing one another. Nala didn't flinch this time. She stood her ground, her chin tilted up, realizing that for the first time in her life, her mind was not just a hiding place, but a throne. The morning after the failed merger brought a different kind of tension to the penthouse. A quiet, heavy air that felt less like a siege and more like an awakening. Ryung had summoned a phalanx of silent, efficient tailors and high-end couriers who arrived with racks of monochromatic silk, structured blazers, and sharp-edged couture that mirrored the cold, clinical lines of his own world. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his wet hair slicked back, watching Nala as she walked among the expensive fabrics. He expected her to choose the armor he had provided, the muted grays and blacks that would allow her to blend into the shadows of his syndicate. But Nala did not reach for the charcoal silks. Instead, her fingers sought out the textures that spoke to a deeper memory, a history that Jerry had tried to bleach from her soul. From the curated selection, she pulled pieces that defied the sterile minimalism of the penthouse. A deep ochre wrap made of heavy, raw silk that caught the morning light like the earth of a distant continent. a structural duster coat in a vibrant, burnt orange print that mimicked the geometric precision of her ancestors' weaving, and gold jewelry that was bold, heavy, and unashamed. When she emerged from the dressing suite, she was no longer the shivering girl in the torn white dress. She stood tall, the warm tones of her heritage clashing beautifully with the cold basalt of Ryung's home. The indigo of her previous dress was gone, replaced by colors that radiated a solar heat. Ryung turned away from the glass, his breath hitching almost imperceptibly as he took her in. She hadn't just changed her clothes, she had reclaimed her space. The wooden beads were still there, tucked into a pocket, but the woman holding them now looked as if she could command the very rain that had once tried to drown her. He walked toward her, the scent of cedar and expensive metal following him like a wake. He stopped just outside her personal space, his gaze traveling from her crown of natural curls to the steady, lethal focus in her eyes. "I offered you a disguise," he murmured, his voice a low, resonant vibration that carried a new note of awe. "I thought you needed to be invisible to stay safe. I thought you were a ghost wandering through my halls, waiting for a chance to vanish." He reached out, his hand pausing near the vibrant fabric of her sleeve before he looked directly into her soul. The coldness that had defined him for years seemed to fracture, a genuine, intrigued respect burning through the ice. "But I see now that I was wrong. You aren't a shadow, Nala. I thought you were a ghost, but you are a storm. And a storm doesn't hide, it changes the landscape." In that moment, the strategy of the syndicate was forgotten, replaced by a promising, grounded love that recognized her not as an asset to be managed, but as a sovereign force to be feared and adored. The quiet of the penthouse was shattered not by a sound, but by the sudden, systemic failure of the building's internal grid. The floor-to-ceiling windows, usually a transparent veil over the city, became dark mirrors as the red emergency lights pulsed like a dying heartbeat. Ryung was on his feet before the first alert chimed on his handheld, his movement a blur of predatory grace. Across the city, the low-level syndicate Jerry had served had finally realized their golden goose, Nala's clean identity, was no longer laying eggs. They were coming for the accounts, and they were bringing Jerry as their bloodhound. "Lock down the lower levels," Ryung commanded, his voice a low, lethal vibration that signaled the onset of war. His men moved with military precision, sliding heavy ceramic plates over the glass and arming the perimeter. He turned to Nala, his eyes dark with a protective intensity that bordered on ferocity. "Go to the safe room in the gallery. Stay behind the reinforced steel. My men will handle this." But Nala did not move toward the shadows. Instead, she stepped into the center of the room, the vibrant burnt orange of her duster coat standing out against the crimson emergency strobes. She looked at the monitors, where thermal signatures were already breaching the lobby 300 feet below. She saw Jerry's silhouette among the mercenaries, a frantic, desperate shape clinging to the power of others. "No," Nala said, her voice steady, carrying the weight of the ancestors she had called upon in the dark. "Jerry spent 5 years telling me I was a ghost. He used my name to build his empire of filth, and he believes he still owns the ink in my veins. If I hide now, I am proving him right." She walked toward Ryung, stopping only when she was inches from his chest, the scent of cedar and ozone between them crackling with the heat of the coming storm. "He isn't just coming for a bank account, Ryung. He's coming for the cage. I won't be a prize you protect. I am the one who holds the keys to the vault he needs to survive. I am going to the front line." Ryung looked at her, his jaw tightening as he prepared to argue, to command, to exert the dominance that had kept him at the top of the food chain for a decade. But as he searched her wide, expressive eyes, he didn't see the trapped bird anymore. He saw the storm she had become. He realized that to protect her by hiding her would be a different kind of erasure. He reached out, his hand cupping the back of her neck, his thumb grazing the warm skin of her jaw in a gesture that was half caress, half vow. "The front line is a place of blood and iron, Nala," he murmured, his voice thick with a profound, promising respect. "It is not a place for ghosts." "Good," she countered, her fingers tightening around the wooden beads in her pocket before she let them go, her hands ready for a different kind of work. "Because I've never felt more alive." With a sharp nod, Ryung signaled his lead tactician to hand her a comms unit. He didn't put her behind him, he placed her at his side. As the elevator began its ascent with the first wave of attackers, the Korean Mafia boss and the woman who had mastered his digital shadows stood together, a dragon and a storm, ready to conduct a final audit that Jerry Hudson would not survive. The elevator doors groaned as they were forced open, and the sterile, high-altitude sanctuary of the penthouse was breached by the stench of rain and desperation. Jerry stumbled into the red pulsing light of the emergency strobes, flanked by 3 hired men whose guns were leveled at the shadows. He looked manic, his hair plastered to his forehead, his eyes darting across the basalt floors until they landed on Nala. He didn't see the indigo silk or the golden jewelry. He didn't see the woman who had reclaimed her soul. He saw his laundry girl, his firewall, his property. "Nala, get over here," he screamed, his voice cracking with a high-pitched, toxic entitlement. "You think this billionaire is going to keep you? You're a ghost, Nala. You're nothing but a name on a bank statement I own. Give me the bypass codes, or we all burn this place to the ground." Nala didn't flinch. She stepped forward, moving out of the protective silhouette of Ryung's presence and into the center of the room. The vibrant orange of her duster coat seemed to catch the emergency light, making her look like a flickering flame in the dark. She looked at Jerry, the man who had spent half a decade convinced he was the architect of her prison, and for the first time, she felt nothing but a cold, clinical pity. "You're wrong, Jerry," she said, her voice a calm, crystalline resonance that made the mercenaries hesitate. "You never owned the name. You just borrowed the shadow it cast." Jerry laughed, a jagged, ugly sound. "The codes, Nala. The syndicate wants their money, and they want it now. Don't make me remind you what happens when you don't listen." He took a lunging step toward her, but he stopped dead when Nala didn't move. She didn't look like a trapped bird anymore. She looked like the storm that had finally made landfall. "There are no codes anymore, Jerry," she said, her expressive eyes locking onto his with a lethal focus. "While you were busy trying to find a way into this building, I was busy finding a way out of the cage you built. I didn't just walk away from your accounts. I audited them. I used the very hypervigilance you taught me to trace every shadow, every ghost transaction, and every penny of that blood money." She took a slow, deliberate step toward him, her hands steady at her sides. "I've locked the global nodes. I've triggered a hard reset on the shell corporations. The money isn't moving, Jerry. It's frozen. And the only person who can unfreeze it is a woman you told the world didn't exist." Jerry's face went pale, the bravado draining out of him like water through a sieve. You can't. That's millions. They'll kill us both." "No," Nala countered, her voice dropping to a register of absolute sovereignty. "They'll kill you, because to them you're just a low-level liability who lost the keys to the vault. I am no longer your laundry girl, Jerry. I am the one holding the ledger of your life, and I just closed the books." She looked through him as if he were a minor inconvenience, a ghost from a past life she had already outgrown. In that moment, she wasn't just staring him down, she was presiding over his end. Ryung watched from the shadows, his hand resting on his blade, but his heart fixed on the woman who had just become her own executioner. The orphan Jerry had tried to bury was gone, and in her place stood a woman who had turned her paper cage into a throne. The chaos that had briefly turned the penthouse into a battlefield evaporated as quickly as a summer storm, leaving behind a silence that was heavy with the scent of ozone and the weight of a finished era. Jerry was no longer a man. He was a hollow, trembling ruin, his face a mask of disbelief as Ryung's men moved in with the silent, surgical efficiency of the shadows they inhabited. There was no grand struggle, no final heroic shout. Jerry was simply erased, dragged toward the elevator while he continued to mutter that Nala was nothing, his voice trailing off into a pathetic, distant echo that the reinforced glass of the penthouse swallowed whole. Nala stood in the center of the room, her burnt orange duster coat draped over her shoulders like a regal robe, her fingers finally letting go of the wooden beads in her pocket. She didn't look at the elevator. She didn't look at the ghosts of the marriage that had tried to bury her alive. Instead, she walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, which were now sliding open to let in the crisp, post-storm air. Ryung followed her, his steps slow and deliberate. He didn't approach her as a savior claiming a prize, nor as a master checking on an asset. He stopped a few feet away, leaning against the basalt railing of the balcony, his dark eyes fixed on the city below. The neon lights were starting to flicker back to life, reflecting off the damp streets like a million discarded jewels. "The accounts are clean," Ryung said, his voice a low, resonant vibration that carried no trace of his usual clinical ice. "My technicians have spent the last hour unweaving the digital cage. Your name is no longer a laundry trail, Nala. Your heritage is no longer a firewall. You are, for the first time in 5 years, a woman who exists only to herself." Nala turned to him, the wind catching her natural curls and the heavy gold of her earrings. She looked at the man who had misjudged her as a ghost, only to find himself standing beside a storm. "And what happens to the woman who exists only to herself?" she asked, her voice steady and carrying a new, sovereign depth. Ryung turned his head, his gaze locking onto hers with a profound, quiet intensity. The vacuum of power he usually projected had shifted, replaced by a grounded, promising heat. "Most people in this city look for someone to belong to," he murmured, taking a step closer until the scent of cedar and rain-washed stones surrounded them both. "They look for a master or a servant, but I have spent my life building a throne out of ice, and I find it remarkably cold." He reached out, his hand hovering in the air between them, an open invitation rather than a command. "I don't want your submission, Nala. I don't want a ghost to haunt these halls. I want a partner who can see the traps I miss. I want the storm to stay." Nala looked at his hand, then back at his eyes. She saw the shared history of their hollow shell beginnings and the mutual survival that had forged this moment. She didn't reach out because she was afraid or because she had nowhere else to go. She reached out because she had finally found an equal. As her fingers brushed his, the connection was electric, a silent vow between two architects of their own sanctuaries. They stood together on the balcony, two sovereigns overlooking a kingdom of shadows, not as master and victim, but as a dragon and a storm who had decided to rule the horizon together. The orphan Jerry had tried to bury was gone, and in her place stood a queen whose love was as lethal and enduring as the city itself. Nala's journey is a reminder that you are not the labels others print on your skin. For 5 years, Jerry used her as a ghost in a ledger, convinced that her lack of family made her a woman without a foundation. He mistook her silence for emptiness. But as Nala stood in the dragon's den, she realized her African roots weren't a memory to be buried. They were the very steel in her spine. She didn't need Ryung to save her. She needed him to witness her stop running. This is for anyone who has ever felt like a human shield for someone else's chaos. Your survival isn't a debt you owe the world. It is the throne you've already built. Like Nala, you aren't a ghost in someone else's story. You are the storm that changes the map. Join the Chronicle. If you felt the heat of Nala's transformation today, don't let her fire fade in the shadows. Like this video if you believe no one has the right to own your name. Share this with a storm in the making who needs to remember their power. Subscribe to Endless Love Chronicles for more soulful, high-stakes storytelling, where the victim always becomes the sovereign. Which moment of Nala's awakening hit you the hardest? Tell me in the comments. I'm reading every one of them.